the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the world stood on the edge of nuclear annihilation. In October 1962, humanity came closer to extinction than at any other point in history. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood locked in a deadly confrontation, each side armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. This moment became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous chapter of the Cold War. The origins of the Cold War. After World War II, the global balance of power shifted dramatically. Europe lay in ruins, and two nations emerged as superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their alliance against Nazi Germany quickly collapsed, replaced by deep mistrust and ideological rivalry. The United States promoted democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union expanded communism and centralized control. Both sides believed the other posed an existential threat. This rivalry did not lead to direct war, but instead to a prolonged period of tension known as the Cold War, a conflict fought through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and most dangerously, nuclear weapons. The nuclear arms race. By the late 1950s, both superpowers possessed nuclear arsenals capable of annihilating entire civilizations. The concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, dominated military strategy. If one side launched nuclear weapons, the other would respond, and both would be destroyed. This fragile balance relied on fear, but fear alone was not enough to prevent escalation. Cuba, a strategic flashpoint. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a successful communist revolution in Cuba, overthrowing the US-backed government of Fulgencio Batista. The United States immediately viewed Castro as a dangerous threat. Cuba was no distant battlefield. It was located just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. As relations between Washington and Havana deteriorated, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union for economic aid and military protection. The Bay of Pigs disaster. In April 1961, the United States attempted to overthrow Castro through a covert operation known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed on the island, expecting popular support. Instead, the invasion collapsed within days. The attackers were captured or killed, and the operation became a global embarrassment for President John F. Kennedy. For Castro, the message was clear: another invasion was likely. For the Soviet Union, it was an opportunity. Soviet missiles in Cuba. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev faced pressure of his own. American nuclear missiles were stationed in Turkey and Italy, within striking distance of Soviet cities. Khrushchev decided to respond by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba. This would protect a Soviet ally, challenge American dominance, and shift the strategic balance. By mid-1962, Soviet ships were transporting nuclear warheads, launchers, and thousands of troops to the island under strict secrecy. Missiles are discovered on October 14, 1962. An American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and captured unmistakable photographs of missile launch sites under construction. 2 days later, President Kennedy was shown the images. The implications were horrifying. Once operational, these missiles could reach Washington, New York, and most major U.S. cities in minutes. Kennedy immediately assembled a group of senior advisors called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. Haramashed, a president's dilemma. The options were grim. Airstrikes could destroy the missile sites, but might miss some, provoking retaliation. A full invasion would almost certainly trigger war with the Soviet Union. Doing nothing was politically and militarily unacceptable. After intense debate, Kennedy chose a middle path: a naval quarantine, avoiding the word blockade, which legally implied an act of war. 13 days of fear. From October 16 to October 28, the world entered a period of unimaginable tension. American naval forces surrounded Cuba. Soviet ships carrying weapons approached the blockade line. U.S. nuclear bombers were placed on constant airborne alert. Schools prepared fallout shelters. Citizens across the world feared the end was near. October 27, Black Saturday. The crisis reached its peak on October 27th, later called Black Saturday. A U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing pilot Rudolph Anderson. American generals urged Kennedy to retaliate immediately. At the same time, a Soviet submarine, cut off from communication and under attack by U.S. depth charges, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. Only the refusal of one officer, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented nuclear war. The fate of the world hung by a thread. Hush. Diplomacy behind closed doors. While the public saw confrontation, secret diplomacy was unfolding. Khrushchev sent letters to Kennedy proposing missile removal in exchange for U.S. guarantees. Kennedy responded carefully, publicly accepting one proposal while privately agreeing to remove American missiles from Turkey. This compromise allowed both sides to step back without humiliation. The crisis ends. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. The United States pledged not to invade Cuba. Quietly, American missiles were later withdrawn from Turkey. The world had survived. Consequences and legacy. The Cuban Missile Crisis permanently changed international relations. A direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow. Nuclear arms control efforts intensified. Leaders became more cautious in managing crises. Most importantly, the crisis demonstrated how close miscalculation could bring humanity to extinction. Final reflection. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a political conflict, it was a test of human judgment under extreme pressure. For 13 days, the survival of civilization depended on restraint, communication, and courage. Its lessons remain urgent today, because in a world with nuclear weapons, peace is never guaranteed, and history reminds us how close we have already come to losing everything.